Welcome. In Westbridge, every notification carries a story. A simple message can change a life. And sometimes, love begins beyond the screen. The phone buzzed against a stack of overdue notices, a small, bright insistence in a room full of hush and paper. Tessa glanced at it without moving the book she was cataloging, the tiny blue notification light like a moth against the fluorescent hum. Then set the spine back in its place, and wiped her hands on her cardigan before she picked it up. The message preview was brief, the punctuation neat. I think I may have known you years ago at the library. Would you be open to coffee? I wanted to say thank you. Grayson. She almost laughed at the neatness of his name. Grayson Hale. It sounded like someone from another town where men kept 2 phones and 3 suits. In Westbridge, names arrived softened by wind and time. People were Mrs. Lauren, Sam from the Post, the girl who waters the window boxes. Grayson was a name that made her think of glass towers and city cabs, and afternoons that started with other people's calendars. She tucked the phone into the pocket of her cardigan and kept shelving. The library smelled like lemon oil and old glue, the familiar ache of pages pushed together for years. Laya, her 4-year-old, had been at preschool that morning, and would be home with Miss Carter's neighbor later. So there would be time, if she wanted to meet. She set the last biography in place, straightened the placard that read Children's Corner, and let the thought sit like a pebble in her palm. Curiosity, and a little wariness. Outside, rain had been steady for a week. The pines around Westbridge shed a persistent wet scent that reminded Tessa of her own mother's hands, of chamomile tea poured too quickly into chipped cups. It started to patter at the big window by the checkout desk, a soft percussion she had learned to read. Rain made the town smaller and kinder, brought neighbors to the hardware store and the diner with their umbrellas dripping. Brought the kind of quiet where people remembered the small things. It had been quiet enough, until the little light insisted there was someone who wanted to say thank you. Across the country, 2 airline terminals and 1 long windowed corridor away, Grayson Hale watched his phone buzz in the bottom of his briefcase and let it go. He had come back to Westbridge on business, a meeting, a site visit for a small community project his company had been approached about. It was part logistics, part nostalgia that didn't know its own name. He told himself the trips were efficient, a chance to sign papers, to see the town his father had fled, to check that the place he remembered had not changed into a place he could no longer read. His calendar was honest to the minute. He had time to leave his mark where it mattered. He had time for 1 coffee between a board call and a luncheon. His message that morning had been clean and tentative. He typed, erased, tried another tone. In the end he chose short, simple without flourish, because the memory of a smell can be enough without explanation. He thought, oddly, of a brown paper bag once left under a library table, like a promise folded into wax paper. He could not place the hands that had tucked it there. It had been a long time. He thought of the town's library as the circumference of a life he'd left by accident, and sometimes by choice. The message was meant to close a circle, to say thank you in a quiet way that would not demand anything in return. Tessa turned the phone over in her hands. There was nothing about Grayson's life on the screen to tell her whether he was a tourist, a benefactor, a man with a secret. Westbridge had taught her to read the lines between people's words. You noticed whether someone set their eyes on the floor, whether they left bread on the table for the children after a funeral, whether they paid you back in tears or paid it forward with steady hands. Gratitude that sought nothing back was a rare thing, and it pulled at something inside her that had learned to be fiercely self-sufficient. She had become a single mother by accident of a life she had not planned to script. She had learned how to answer forms and phone calls, and at 2 in the morning to warm soup while the world let itself sleep. Asking for help had been a language she refused to be fluent in. She considered the DM as she walked toward the back door after closing. Laya would be home under the watchful eye of the neighbor, and she could accept. Public place, daytime, library cafe right on Main. That would be safe. She tapped a reply and then read it a dozen times before hitting send. Coffee would be fine, she wrote. There's a small cafe in the library, Main Street, if that works. The reply came back within the hour. I'll be there Wednesday morning. Thank you. G. There was a tiny folding of the shoulders inside her chest when she let her phone rest in the rice bowl near the sink. The bowl where she kept loose change, scotch tape, the little key to Laya's music box. The DM became a small hinge in the door of a door she had kept shut. She told herself nothing would change. She told herself she had simply agreed to meet a stranger who might remember a detail of her childhood. She told herself she deserved the curiosity. If you love healing stories, hit like and stay with us for the whole journey. She wanted to say to the quiet hallway of herself, where all the small decisions added up. Instead, she hummed, put on the kettle, and clipped Laya's frothy dress from the drying line. Wednesday arrived with the kind of heavy, low clouds that made the town feel wrapped in wool. The library cafe had mismatched chairs and a counter painted the color of old mint. The smell inside was not only coffee, but butter and rosemary from the pan that warmed the morning sandwiches. There were children's drawings taped by the windows and a notice board with farm stand flyers. Grayson arrived in a coat that had seen better briefings and in shoes that could have been shined in a dozen cities. He looked around once, as if scanning for a landmark his memory might honor. Then his gaze settled on the line of book spines and the child-sized table where a photograph of the town's founder had been stapled beside a flyer for summer reading. He saw Tessa before she saw him, the way she stood behind the counter organizing, the light haloed by her hair where it caught a stray sunbeam through the glass. She was quieter than the room, but she did not fade into it. She had a manner that kept things soft and orderly, like the way she folded paper into envelopes before she stamped them for the children's book club. He felt, unexpectedly, the tip of a memory like a page corner he hadn't turned yet. When she looked up, their eyes met. Tessa felt an odd prickle that was not fear, so much as the startle of recognition, like seeing a name on a yearbook and knowing you had looked past it before. She reached for the small bell on the counter, then laughed to herself and walked to him. "Grayson," she said, feeling the syllable strange in her mouth, as if a town had to learn to say a city's name well. "You made it. Thanks for the message." He offered a hand that was steady. "Tessa, thank you for meeting." There was an economy to their small talk, the sort of conversation that leaves room for more. Grayson asked the necessary questions: how long she had worked at the library, whether Laya was local, whether the town still held the summer fair, and he listened with a warmth that felt deliberate. He did not make sweeping claims of nostalgia. He did not tell her how he had always followed the library's newsletter since he left. Instead, he asked about the stacks, about the soup kitchen the library hosted on the first Thursday of every month, about whether the children's corner still had the green carpet. His attention was a kind of neutral charity, not extravagant, simply present. Tessa answered in the way people answer about the things they love, with small corrections and the pride that comes from stewardship. The green carpet had faded, but it was still there. They had added a mobile with paper birds last summer. She told him about Laya's favorite book, a thin volume about a fox who learned to bake bread. "She likes the illustrations," Tessa said. "She remembers the crumbs." He smiled at that. "My sister used to say the same thing about crumbs," he said, which brought a ripple of something in the air that both of them recognized as memory surfacing. He paused, choosing words with a care that made him more human than the title on his business cards had a right to be. "I used to leave a sandwich sometimes. Don't laugh. A paper bag on the table near the window. My mother, she would pack lunches for the kids who stayed after school. I guess I kept doing it, even after—" He didn't finish, and Tessa did not need him to. The brown bag lunches were not a single image so much as an inheritance of small kindnesses that had anchored her childhood. A paper bag with a sandwich meant someone had noticed a kid alone and thought enough to fold the top over the bread and tuck in an apple. Memory, in Westbridge, moved like that. One small gift passed quietly along until it was larger than the hand that offered it. "You left one?" Tessa said, neither accusing nor praising. She felt, oddly, like a gap had just been announced between them, a puzzle piece that might fit. He looked at her then with something like apology. Maybe I did. It's foggy. But the smell of those lunches, brown paper and cheddar and a little wax paper, it's the kind of thing that returns on a day when you don't expect it." They talked about other things, about how the library had become a place where children sat on the rug and recited rhymes, about town events that pulled people together. Tessa watched him as she spoke, and beneath her caution, there was an awareness that he listened like someone cataloging a memory for safekeeping. He did not offer money for the library then. He did not speak of donations or renovations. The conversation moved around those subjects like a respectful tide. When he finally asked, careful, probing, aware of the terrain, about whether the library needed anything. She named practical things: window seals that let in rain, a children's computer that kept freezing, a volunteer roster that was thin in the afternoon. She paused, gauging his reaction. It was a moment edged with the two languages she had to balance: accepting help and preserving independence. "We patch what we can," she said. "But people in town give time. I don't want to take what's more than that." He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "I understand," he said. "And I don't want to take. If there's a practical thing that would help keep it open or safe, I'd like to know. Or better, if there's a way I can help without it being a headline." Tessa smiled at the phrase, "without it being a headline." She pictured a city donation announcement wrapped in ribbon and cameras, her name listed in a press release she did not want. "We don't like headlines here," she said. "Just hands." "Hands," he echoed. He pointed at a nearby display of children's books. "Reads count too." At some point in the conversation, Laya appeared, a small comet in a pink tutu, cheeks the color of raspberries from running in the drizzle. Her hair was a tangle in a loose clip. She looked up at the taller man with the small, size-equalizing honesty of children. "He's the one who left the sandwich," Tessa said before she could stop herself. She braced for the word charity to hover between them like a winter bird. Laya considered Grayson like an object she had to test. "Are you the sandwich man?" she asked. Grayson crouched to her level, eyes soft. "Sometimes I used to be. But now I'm more of a reader. Do you like reading?" Laya nodded as if that answered everything. "I like the fox who bakes bread." She hopped one foot, then both. "My mom can't bake bread like the fox, but she makes chicken with rosemary, and it tastes like real dinner." She swung the tutu, and then, as children do, she added an immediate verdict. "You're not scary at all." Tessa almost melted at that, and yet she kept herself measured. Grayson's smile at Laya was not performative. There was a tenderness that surprised him as much as it warmed Tessa. He reached into his pocket and produced a small paper-wrapped cookie, like a relic from a thoughtful purse. Laya's face lit up, and Tessa felt the world contract to the precise geometry of that gift. Not ostentatious, not controlling, just parallel kindness. They walked to the children's corner together. Grayson read a paragraph out loud from a torn picture book and mispronounced a character's name in such a way that Laya corrected him, delighted. The library filled with that domestic sound. The page flip, the low rustle of the heater, a late return clacking at the desk. Tessa watched him read and felt something settle that was not surrender, but an allowance. She could let this stranger be in their morning because he had not demanded entry. He had asked permission. Afterward, before they parted, Grayson hesitated and asked if he could do something small. "If you'll let me," he said. "I'd like to bring by some of the children's copies that we have in our company library. They've been sitting in a box, good as new. No names, no press. I can leave them with Mrs. Carter at the front desk." It was practical, anonymous, and still generous. Tessa blinked. She measured the offer against the scale of her own carefulness. "That would be useful," she said slowly. "But it has to be quiet. If it's public, people will ask questions." He nodded. "Quiet," he promised. They agreed to a slow, uncomplicated exchange. Books left in a nondescript brown box at the back entrance, labeled with only the date. He would deliver them in the evening when the library staff were leaving, when the town was less likely to make a story of it. Tessa felt the odd relief of not having said yes to charity, but having accepted help in a way that preserved her agency and, more importantly, her dignity. The words dignity and help moved together in her head, like two dancers learning the same steps. They parted on the street outside the library, the rain a softened sheet that kissed the pavement, and Grayson tucked his hands into his coat, like someone who had been given permission to hold something particular. "I'm glad I sent that message," he said. "I didn't imagine I'd be this welcome." "You were polite," Tessa said. "That matters." He smiled then, the smile of a man who respected a boundary offered and kept. He left with the kind of gentleness you give to fragile things. The week after their meeting settled into a slower rhythm of small reciprocities. Grayson did not storm into town the way men in movies burst into small lives with checkbooks and proclamations. Instead, He arranged for the books to be shelved with a soft note to the librarian and a small anonymous donation that paid for a new ceiling strip on a window in the reading room. It arrived as a letter through the library's own mail slot, folded into an envelope that bore no name. That was precisely what Tessa had hoped for, and precisely what she feared. It preserved the public narrative of her competence while allowing the library to breathe. There were other small things. Grayson volunteered one afternoon at story hour because his calendar had a gap, and he found himself reading to a half-circle of children who demanded he use different voices. He learned, to his surprise, how calming it was to see a child's attention anchor in the cadence of a narrative. He sat in a chair that had once belonged to the town's high school, and listened as Leia corrected him gently on the names of the animals. He learned, too, that the work of being present was different than the work of writing a check. Tessa watched, often from just beyond the table with her hands around a mug of chamomile, and she measured the man not by his outward signs, but by his small movements. The way he washed his hands before he fed a child a piece of fruit. The way he sat patiently when a book was read twice because a child asked it. The way he did not look for accolades. These were small calibrations that mattered. They were the opposite of headline charity. They resembled friendship. Still, there were days when she bristled against the tug of having another adult in their orbit. Tessa had trained herself to be the parent who could schedule appointments, who could explain homework, who could answer the unbidden questions about tired mornings. The thought of anyone else stepping into that space made her protective in the way that parents are protective of routines. A single mother builds borders around her child's life because safety often comes with shape. On one of those evenings, after Grayson had left a box of picture books at the library's back door with a note that simply read, "A small gift for the children of Westbridge," she found herself sitting at the sink while Leia ate rosemary chicken warmed in a pan, its aroma filling the tiny kitchen like an offering. Leia was chattering about a fox and the way oven heat felt like summer. Tessa listened and felt her chest loosen. She had been vigilant, yes, but she had not expected to feel this comfortable at the edges of someone else's care. An ordinary Thursday came with its ordinary quiet until, in the night, a neighbor called. "I'm Jameson," Tessa said, the name a shorthand for the man who lived next door and watched out for stray packages. His voice on the phone was clipped, the kind of directness that concealed worry. "Is everything okay?" Tessa tucked Leia into bed and kissed her forehead, a soft touch that was part benediction, part ritual. The house smelled of the rosemary sauce and lemon peel. A lamp hummed on the counter where she had left a novel half read. She felt the small, steady pulse of the day move toward sleep. "We've got a fever," Miss Carter said on the line later, not the neighbor. "It spiked quick. I'm bringing her to the clinic." Tessa's stomach folded. Her hands became practical without intention. She set a cool cloth on Leia's brow, checked the thermometer twice as if the numbers might contest themselves back to normal. Leia slept like a small storm, breathing shallow, occasionally murmuring about the fox who couldn't find his flower. She called the clinic, and then the neighbor, and then, the shape of the world narrowing, she called for help. Her phone, the same device that had held Grayson's message, sat like a small island of light. She thumbed his name with a thumb that would not have trembled if it were just a broken tooth or a trip to the grocer. This was her child. The first ring went straight to voicemail. She left a terse message, composed of facts and not panic. "Leia has a fever. Miss Carter is at the clinic. Can you—" He called back within the coil of 3 rings, voice on the other end immediate, not surprised, and as if a meeting were not required to offer the basic decency of presence. "Where are you?" he asked. "At the clinic," she said. "The one by the river." "I'm on my way," he said simply. She hung up and felt both grateful and oddly ashamed of her gratitude. The thing she bristled at earlier, someone stepping in, was being asked now as a shelter. Dignity, she reminded herself, was not the absence of needing help, but the right to choose how it comes. Grayson arrived with a coat still damp from the drizzle and hands that were not ostentatious. He did not carry a folder of forms or a checkbook. He carried an extra blanket and a packet of ginger chews, a small, ordinary kindness, and the steadiness of someone who had learned to be present without announcement. At the clinic the lights were soft, and the nurses moved with efficient comfort. Leia lay in a narrow bed with a teddy pulled to her chin, murmuring the fox's lines in half-sleep. Grayson sat by the bed like the corner of a table. Simple in the room, steady as a presence that had not bargained for anything. When the nurse gently explained the routine, fluids, rest, measurements, he listened and nodded as if he had been sitting in rooms like this before. He offered to wait. Tessa declined at first, then accepted. Not because she needed a body in the room, but because a human voice in the hall read the procedure out loud to her in a language she could trust. He sat in the plastic chair and read a ragged paperback that had been left in the clinic's waiting area. At one point he pushed away the book and, with care, reached for Laya's small hand and smoothed the hair from her forehead. He did not speak loudly. He asked the nurse once if there was anything he could do, and when the nurse shook her head, he folded his hands in his lap and watched the child breathe. The act of not performing help and simply staying was a kind of support Tessa had not catalogued in her list of accepted favors. In the small hours, while the clinic did its steady work of monitoring and the rain kept writing soft letters on the roof, there were moments Tessa could not name. She caught herself watching him, as if he were a map whose contours she needed to read to find her way to something else. A future that might allow help without humiliation. He had not pushed. When he had offered the books and the window strips, he had done so in the exact shape she could accept. When her daughter's forehead had needed a cool cloth, he had not looked at his watch. You measured people in how they acted when they were not obliged to. Grayson's actions measured him kind. On the drive home later, after Laya's temperature had been broken with the slow intervention of nurses and medicine that looked like tiny compromises, Tessa sat quiet and let the darkness through the windshield blot the town into swaths of light. Laya slept in the back seat, the tutu folded like an afterthought, a small rise beneath the blanket. Grayson drove with a calm that suggested practice. His hands on the wheel were not aggressive but careful. He gave her space to explain nothing. When they reached her house, he lingered at the door. "If you need anything at all." He stopped, searching for a form that would not sound like patronage. "You offered books," she said, surprising herself with the softness of gratitude. "You fixed a window strip anonymously. That was enough." He nodded as if it were a gift he had been given by a stranger. "If you need a ride to the clinic or someone to sit with you while Laya's fever runs, call. I won't announce it. I'll come as—" He floundered for the word and found none he liked. "As a neighbor," Tessa finished. She meant it. The word neighbor carried the exact kinship she could accept. He smiled then, and it was small and contained. "As a neighbor," he affirmed. She closed the door on the night with a hand that trembled for reasons she could not entirely account for. It had been a week of small courtesies, a week in which she had allowed a past kindness to bind with present care. She had kept her agency intact, and, in the act of leaving an envelope unopened for a week, had discovered that not all help arrived with a headline. The next morning dawned with thin sun and a hush of wind that made the laundry line sing. Laya was quieter than usual, her energies muffled by the residue of the fever. Tessa made chamomile tea and sat with the cup cupped between both hands until it cooled. She would call the pediatrician, arrange for a slow day in which the world softened. She would not ask for more than she needed. When the phone rang, it was a number she knew, M. Jameson. His voice carried the kind of directness that could mean anything from found mail to an emergency. "Tessa," he said without preamble. "Derek's back in town." The name struck her with the dull thud of an unexpected stone. Derek, the child's biological father, had been an outline in her life, an absence that had once been supposed and then legally adjusted. He had not been part of their daily world for years. She had imagined his existence as a far horizon, something that might blur but never come close. "What does that mean?" she asked, trying to maintain composure. Laya stirred on the couch, a small shift in her sleep. "He's at the diner," Jameson said, talking loud. "Says he needs to see his daughter." Tessa's skin cooled as if a draft had passed over it. This was a problem that arrived in paperwork and courtrooms, and late-night phone calls, a conflict that cost time and lawyers and the kind of energy Tessa had banked carefully to spend on hair braids and dinner. She had not expected it now, not with a child still recovering from fever. "Thanks," she said. She took a breath that tried to read the shape of what would come next. Presence, she thought, not control. Independence, she thought, not isolation. She set the phone down and crossed the room to check Laya's forehead once more. Outside, the town went about its routines. Inside, the small house contained a pulse of uncertainty. Tessa found, in that chest of worry, a memory she had mostly kept folded: the brown bag, the sandwich, a child's small warmth offered by someone who did not demand attention. She thought of that as she held Laya's hand and listened to the soft breath of her sleeping child. There would be a need for papers and signatures and forms she would rather not face. There would be questions about custody and about the rights of a father who had been absent. Dererick's return was a fissure that traced back to the day she chose to raise a child on her own terms. In that quiet morning, she felt her earlier resolve, the same resolve that had refused headline charity, harden like bread crust. She would protect her daughter. She would not make decisions that traded dignity for expedience. There, at the threshold of what might become a legal skirmish, she reached for the phone and found Grayson's number. He had not come with the swagger of a rescuer the way men in stories sometimes did. He had come with the steadiness of hands who would hold a blanket in a thunderstorm. She called, her voice steady as she could make it, and explained the situation in the few sentences that allowed for nothing more than facts. "I don't know how long he'll stay," she said. "But if he asks, I want to be ready." "I'll be there," Grayson answered without hesitation. It was a small sentence, one that would reverberate. He didn't promise to solve it. He didn't promise a check or a headline. He promised to be present. Tessa breathed out, the smallest of reliefs. It was not a cure for what might come, but it was more workable than the neatness of charity or the drama of spectacle. It was a neighbor stepping across the threshold in a practical, human way. They met at the corner of the diner where the air still smelled like fried eggs and coffee oil. Grayson arrived without a fleet of assistants, without a note for the press. He carried himself in the unassuming way of people accustomed to being careful in small towns. Dererick, when she saw him, was neither villain nor father in the portraits she had once painted of him in private. He was a man who had returned and had a stubbornness like a coat he could not shrug off. He talked loud in the diner as if loudness could substitute for the slow work of proof. Tessa listened as he demanded to see his daughter. She held Laya back gently, as if shielding her with the same care she used when she wrapped a bandage. She told him, quietly and directly, that she was the child's primary caretaker. She listed the days, the events, the doctor's visits that mapped the life she had made. He asked about papers and rights. The diner's vinyl chairs held the town's curiosity like a spool. Grayson stood nearby, the way a bridge stands near a river. Steady, unadvertised. He did not intervene with speeches or with assumptions. He watched Dererick's face like someone who catalogued expressions. He could see the man's argument forming, absence versus presence, and he could choose to intervene in noisy ways or practical ones. He chose practical. "I have a lawyer," Dererick said finally, as if announcing a currency. He used the word like it was intended to be the end of things. Tessa felt the air go thin. "Sign something, then," she said. And in the public hush of the diner, the word was less an invitation than a shield. The town watched, because that's what towns do. They watch their own unravel and wonder if it will knit back together. Grayson stepped forward with a small, measured suggestion. "If you need legal representation," he said, careful not to frame it as a favor, "I can connect you to counsel who understands family law and who can walk you through the process. They help people sort fact from assumption." She looked at him, measuring whether this was another offer that asked for admission to the board. He read the look and did not press. "Engagement, not enforcement," he added, as if speaking both to her and to the room. "I can arrange for counsel to be there at the outset, to make sure everything proceeds fairly. If she needs time, or if the timing's bad, I'll make sure the family can get advice." Tessa felt the warmth of that practical support like a hand at the back of her neck. It was not charity. It was a way to level the field against a man who had returned with the mechanics of a legal claim. She thought of the dignity of being able to file a response without having to sell herself in public. She thought of Laya, and how small lives needed grown-up work done quietly. Dererick scoffed loud enough to make the diner look up. "Is this a city play? Do you think you can buy the right to a child?" His voice carried the old threat that men use to obscure the fact that they do not know how to be present. Grayson did not meet the bait. "I think the law will sort out what's proper," he said. I just don't think the answer should be decided in the diner. His calm was a brace. If you'd like to file, do it through the clerk's office. Someone will help you with the forms. He pulled a small card out and offered it to Derrick like a mediator, not an ultimatum, but a chance to move the argument into a procedural space. Derrick took the card, maybe as an insult or maybe as a lifeline. He left, muttering. The small world of the diner folded back to normal. Tessa stood rooted, though her limbs had felt like walking for miles. She felt the possibility of paperwork and days in court like a low rumble in the distance. She felt gratitude that was not naive. She felt protectiveness that was fierce. Grayson walked with her to her car and carried 2 bags she had forgotten to lift. He did not make promises he could not keep. "If you want me to contact someone, I will," he offered. "If you want space, I'll give it. I'll do whatever you ask." She looked at him, and for the first time since he had sent that message, she said a small, honest thing. "I want someone who listens, not someone who decides for me." He put his hands up. "I hear you. I'll listen." They drove away from the diner into a day that had the tendency of small towns to hold Sundays in the middle of the week. The line of low clouds made the world feel tender. Tessa sat with her hands on the steering wheel and thought of every small kindness that had taught her to keep her own dignity. The woman who patched Laya's dress at the holiday bazaar, the neighbor who handed over jars of jam, the librarian who had once given her an extra scarf on a night when winter had surprised her. She thought of the brown paper bag that had once contained a sandwich and a small note that said simply, "You're not alone." She thought about how a DM had changed the edge of her day, and how a person who had sent that message had shown up when it mattered. It was not rescue. It was presence. That night, as rain stuttered on the eaves and the house settled into its nocturnal creaks, Tessa checked Laya's temperature again. The numbers were stubborn and low, like a promise withheld. She filled a glass and sat down, tracing the rim with a thumb the way parents trace the outline of a life they have to keep steady. In the next room the child breathed like a small bell. Her phone buzzed once more, a gentle insistence. She almost did not look. The day had given her enough surprises. But the name on the screen was Grayson, and the message that followed was simpler than anything he had written before. "I'm nearby. Do you need me to come over? G." She stared at the small notification and felt the weight of a choice. It was not about the man who had returned, or the money he could offer, or the headline he could prevent. It was about whether she would accept a neighbor's presence in the fragile hours. It was about the small way dignity and help could meet at a kitchen table and agree to coexist. She typed 3 words and hit send. "Please come." He was there before she could worry the knot into anything worse. The porch light picked out damp shoulders and a careful smile as Grayson set his coat on the chair by the door and bent to put a spare blanket over Laya's small sleeping form. He moved as if the house already belonged to him in the most ordinary way. He took off his shoes, folded them, and left them by the mat. His hands were warm when he touched the child's forehead. He smelled faintly of coffee and the leather of his bag, not like an intruder at all. Tessa let him. The word neighbor had become, in the last week, a scaffold she could rest against. She made chamomile tea and wrapped the blanket a little tighter, watching the slow rise and fall of Laya's breath. Grayson kept a careful silence that felt like a permission note. Once, in the arc of the night, when Laya gasped and then settled again, he read softly from a small paperback he had found in the clinic's waiting room. It had a fox, of course, and flour, and a line about small mistakes making a life bigger. Tessa listened to him translate the rhythm of the sentences into a lullaby. At dawn, he offered to drive them to the pediatrician. He did not insist. He asked if that would be welcome, and she felt that difference like a hinge. On the drive, the town leaned under low clouds, and a woman on a porch swept fallen leaves with a practiced wrist. Grayson kept the radio off. He asked practical questions about dosing and feeding and what the evening had looked like. He made notes, not on a pad, but in the way he rearranged the conversation to gather the facts they would need if facts became the currency of fate. After the pediatrician pronounced Laya stable enough to stay home and rest, fever reduced, viral, to be monitored, Tessa felt the relief like a tide coming back to shore. She and Grayson walked to the car in the light that softened everything a shade kinder. The pleasantries they had shared a week earlier now felt fortified by the night. He had not announced himself as a benefactor. He had shown up. The distinction mattered. Then Monsieur Jameson's voice on the phone folded the day like a blanket. Derrick had filed. The legal papers arrived with a certain procedural precision. Filed in the county clerk's office. Stamped. A formal petition requesting shared custody and visitation. The letterhead had the name of a lawyer Tessa had never met. The weight of it was immediate. Not a storm, but a slow, grinding weathering. Derrick's paperwork did not promise malevolence. It promised complication. It demanded energy and money. Things Tessa kept rationed for groceries and ballet tights. She called Grayson, and he came with neither fanfare nor a press release. He sat at her kitchen table and filmed the packet once with the small, clinical gaze of someone who had to calculate steps. "We'll need to respond," he said. His voice was plain, the steadiness of a person who had a team and access to resources, and who would not spend them for spectacle. "How?" she asked. The question was simple and also everything. Her options, as she understood them, ranged from representing herself to trying to cobble together a representation that would cost what she did not have. She pictured a courtroom as a stage where poverty and absence were spotlighted, and where she might be asked to explain not only days and medical records, but the shape of a life she had barely finished building. Grayson listened. He did not wrap the offer in rhetoric. "You should have counsel," he said. "Not because you can't tell your story, but because counsel can make the law speak plainly, so the judge hears the facts instead of noise. I can arrange for counsel to consult with you. They would explain options, defending your primary custody, establishing visitation parameters. But whatever you decide, you decide." Tessa's pride rose like a shudder. She wanted to refuse, to insist she would handle it herself. But the exhaustion of the week and the image of Derrick sitting in a courtroom convinced her that pride could be reserved for smaller things, and that this one required someone who knew the legal language. She asked quietly if the counsel would come with strings attached. Grayson reached into his coat pocket and took out a business card, then another, then a small envelope with a different name. "These are people who do family law quietly," he said. "One is a local firm. They've worked pro bono for neighbors before. The other is someone I retained a long time ago who knows how to set up funding discreetly, through a trust or escrow, so the person who receives the money doesn't feel beholden. If you'd prefer, I can simply arrange a meeting so you can pick who you want, and nothing happens unless you authorize it." It mattered to her that the choice rested with her. She picked a small, local firm. The lawyer there was a woman with a steady voice who had grown up 2 towns over, and who wore the sort of cardigan that made strangers trust her. Tessa liked that. The first consultation was not a sales pitch. The lawyer listened, and then, like a good craftsman, mapped the steps. File a response, gather documents showing primary caregiver status, obtain witness statements from Miss Carter and Monsieur Jameson, present pediatric records, and establish Derrick's pattern of absence. The timeline the lawyer sketched was not instant. It would require weeks to months. It might involve mediation. It might involve a hearing. It would require money for retainer fees. Tessa's throat closed. She had planned her life in grocery lists and dental appointments, not legal retainer checks. She bristled at the idea of accepting money. But she also recognized the unfairness of a system where absence could be weaponized if you could not afford an advocate. Grayson did what he had promised. He arranged that the firm's retainer could be covered through an intermediary, a small fund set up to stabilize the family's access to legal counsel. The fund would pay the retainer into the lawyer's trust account, and it would do so with a clause that preserved confidentiality, no public announcement, no donor named. Tessa asked for paperwork and read every line. It was carefully structured, legitimate, traceable, not a handout, but a payment for a legal service with documented purpose. She accepted on the condition that she would always decide whether it would be used further, and that any future funding would be routed through the same anonymous process. She would not be paraded as a recipient, and she would not be expected to cede decisions about Laya's life. Grayson agreed without bargaining. She felt, in the exchange, that a dignity had been preserved. She had not begged. She had chosen a tool. What followed were the slow, patient things courts require. The lawyer filed Tessa's response. Miss Carter wrote a statement about Leia's daily care and how Tessa handled the fever episode. M. Jameson described seeing Derrick's absence over the years. The pediatrician provided records showing regular visits and up-to-date vaccinations. The town's school nurse wrote about Leia's attendance and Tessa's attentive coordination during illnesses. Each small paper was a factual brick laid in a foundation that argued for continuity and best interest. Derrick's side filed quickly, with the energy of someone who assumed the merit lay in simply asking. He claimed his rights. He claimed he wanted to be part of his child's life. The court took the petition seriously. That is its duty. They scheduled a hearing. The courthouse smelled faintly of wax and old paint. It had the necessary gravity of a place where people's private days become public records. On the morning of the hearing, Tessa wore a cardigan the color of chamomile. It felt like armor. Grayson sat quietly in the back, his coat folded over the chair. The picture of someone who had come to bear witness without claiming credit. The hearing was concise. The judge listened with the patient neutrality of someone used to weighing evidence. Tessa's lawyer presented a clear overview. Primary caregiver, continuous residence, documented involvement, and Derrick's long periods of absence with no demonstrable recent contact. The lawyer avoided flourishes. The argument was legal, not theatrical. The standard was the child's best interest. Custody, the judge reminded, was not a prize. It was an arrangement intended to secure a stable environment for the child. Derrick's lawyer argued that the biological parent had rights that deserved consideration. Derrick spoke, his voice a mixture of bravado and apology. He promised to be present. He claimed regret. The judge asked whether he had sought contact before filing and whether he had been consistent in attempts to be part of the child's life. The answer was that he had not. The judge asked about his living situation, his involvement in care, his capacity to support the child day to day. The answers were patchy in a way that mattered. The judge did not pronounce moral judgment. She weighed facts. Witness testimony from Miss Carter about Tessa's handling of the fever, from the pediatrician's record of visits, and from neighbor affidavits about Tessa's consistent presence shaped the decision. She noted that Derrick's return, while not impossible to consider, had to be managed in a way that prioritized continuity and safety. In the end, the judge denied the petition for custody change and ordered a visitation schedule contingent on Derrick completing a parenting class and establishing a stable residence within the county. Standard measures, designed to ease the transition into involvement, rather than to reward sudden reappearances. Tessa felt the floor under her tilt and then settle. She cried quietly, not the public sob, but the small private release of a woman who had just weathered a storm and found the roof intact. Grayson stayed distant in posture, but present in the way he kept his eyes on her like a lighthouse beam. She started, the words slipping into the long breath that followed the judge's gavel. Thank you, she said, instead of a speech. It was not that his money had swayed the judge. What mattered in court were documents and testimony. But the counsel he had enabled, and the way it let her speak in a language the court understood, had changed the scale of what she could do. She had not been rescued. She had been empowered. Grayson nodded. He did not step forward to claim any of it. That was the most important part. In the weeks that followed, life stitched back with slow, hopeful stitches. The legal motion had not become a scandal, and that was precisely what Tessa had wanted. The anonymous mode Grayson requested respected the town's quiet. The library's new books arrived in the brown box at the back door, unlabeled and unannounced. The window seal was replaced. Someone fixed the loose hinge on the children's corner gate. The green carpet kept its faded dignity, and on Sunday afternoons children still curled up in the same circle to recite rhymes. Grayson continued to come to the library at times that fit his schedule, but he asked permission before altering anything. He brought Leia small things, a wooden toy, a bookmark handcrafted with careful edge, and he read with all the absurd voices a responsible adult could muster. He became part of a domestic geography that pulsed around Tessa's rules. When Tessa drew a line, he respected it. When she invited him over for dinner, he showed up with a pie and a willingness to do the dishes. Months later, the town gathered for something that felt like both simple progress and gentle victory: the ribbon cutting for the new children's wing. It was not a towering addition, just an honest room with sunlight, new shelves painted in the soft colors of baked bread, and a plaque that read simply, "For Westbridge's children." The fund that paid for the expansion had been arranged through a charity that accepted anonymous donations. Tessa had given the speech because she wanted the story to belong to the town. She thanked volunteers and Miss Carter and the library's small staff. "We did this together," she said, voice steady, eyes on the people who had become her hands. She said nothing of the anonymous donor who had made the renovations possible. The applause that followed felt communal rather than personal, and that was as she wanted it. Grayson stood to the side with his hands in his coat pockets and held his attention in the exact place of someone who had chosen to be quiet in victory. Laya ran through the new room with a book clutched to her chest and announced, to anyone who would listen, that the Fox would now have his own shelf. The town laughed as if this were the best possible news. After the ribbon cutting, they walked through the stacks while the sun fell a little lower. Tessa paused at a shelf, fingers tracing the spines that now gleamed like new teeth. Grayson watched her and then, softly, handed her a small ring box. It was not an announced ceremony. There were no cameras trained to capture a proposal. He waited until they were out of earshot, in the reading nook he had once admired for having the best light. She opened the box with a thoughtfulness that matched the way she had opened every difficult day since Laya's birth. Inside was a simple band, unadorned, warm with the slight patina of years. It was a ring that had once been in his mother's jewelry box, he said. It was not an offer to marry, he clarified immediately, because he had watched the way people could make heavy things under the guise of romance. It's a promise, he said. To be here. Not to fix anything you don't want fixed. Not to make decisions for you or for Laya. To show up when I say I will, and to leave the headlines to you. Tessa examined the ring, and then looked up at him. The way he said those words made them into the most respectful kind of question. She thought of nights when Bills had frowned at the kitchen table, of fevered little bodies, and the way the town had threaded support through ordinary days. She thought of dignity, and the cost of melting it away for comfort. She thought too of the brown paper bags, and the way kindness had once arrived wrapped in waxed paper. She slid the ring onto her finger in a movement that was neither theatrical nor casual. It fit as if it had been made for the exact structure of her life. I accept a promise, she said. On the terms that we're equals in co-parenting, and that any public thing is decided together. He smiled, and the way his shoulders dropped made him look younger. I thought you'd have conditions, he said. I like conditions. They made a small plan then, not a grand merging of calendars, but a pact to try. Grayson would spend more time in Westbridge, not to impose, but to temper the imposition of distance that had once defined him. He would help with practical things, legal fees if necessary, tutoring funds if Laya ever needed them, a quiet roof if hard times came, always with consent, always behind the scenes unless she asked otherwise. The months that followed were ordinary in the best sense. Grayson split his time more evenly, balancing a city office with a small rental back in Westbridge that let him walk to the library. He read at story hour and learned how to tie shoelaces without asking for a tutorial. He and Tessa found rituals, Saturday mornings at the farmer's stand, an unglamorous weekly grocery run they made together because organizing a household was as much a part of being a family as any romance. Laya learned to make a sandwich with actual precision, and sometimes left a small brown bag, folded without announcement, on a library table on purpose now, an offering she delighted in making. The gesture felt less like charity and more like a child learning the shape of generosity. There were setbacks, a miscommunication about a school event, an unexpected work trip that left a bedtime empty, a legal form that arrived late and required signatures at odd hours. None of these became melodramas. They became negotiations. They argued sometimes about how much help meant involvement. Tessa insisted on being the one to make final decisions about their household. Grayson learned to ask first and to hold back second. The town noticed them, of course. People made small observations that passed like weather, interesting, warm, curious. But Westbridge did not invent narratives out of thin air. People watched, then moved on. That was the way Tessa liked it. On an ordinary morning years later, when the library smelled like lemon oil, and the green carpet still bore the faint map of children's knees, Tessa found an old bookmark wedged into a copy of the Fox book. On the card, someone had written in a small, neat hand, I left my lunch here once. Thank you for keeping a place where small people can be brave. G. She smiled and tucked the bookmark into her cardigan. Laya ran past her in a pink tutu that had seen better afternoons and announced, with all the authority of 4-year-old conviction, that the fox would have pie for dinner. Grayson, who had come to bring a jar of jam from the farmer's stand, sat at the table and listened. The ring on Tessa's finger caught a stray sunbeam and winked like a private joke. They had not changed the world. The change had been quieter and more durable. A new wing where children could find light. A legal result that recognized the shape of a mother's care. A small ring that promised presence without ownership. It began with a message on a phone and grew into a life built of steady, consenting acts. She had been a quiet girl in Westbridge, and she remained that, in many ways. Quiet did not mean invisible. It meant choosing which things were worth making noise for. One DM had nudged a door open, and beyond it had been not a rescue, but the possibility of something steadier than either of them had imagined. A partnership built on respect, a community that kept its own, and a child who would remember only the feel of cakes cooling on a windowsill, and the sound of 2 adults reading in different voices until the fox found his flower. If this story warmed you, subscribe for more tales of quiet kindness and small, steady courage.